and welcome to the Sporting Crypto podcast. You may know Sporting Crypto, the brand, from the newsletter, which you might subscribe to. But today we're doing our first ever podcast episode. And in this series, season 1, we'll be talking to 15 leaders in sport, Web3, or the intersection of those two things, about their journey in this space. And today I am really happy to be joined by Mark Epps, who is the Director of Comms and Web3 at the ATP Tour. Mark, how are you doing?
Great, thanks. It's awesome to be here. I'm going to start by saying thank you for having me, but also how excited I am that you are starting your podcast series. There are no superlatives to describe the Sporting Crypto newsletter. It's read by everybody in the space, and I know that you're going to smash the podcast too. So
thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be your first guest.
I can't think of a better first guest because we've jammed on lots of things when it comes to sport, Web3 for the last couple of years, and so having this in recording and getting it to an audience is going to be awesome. But why don't you start by telling us a bit more about yourself and your journey up until this point?
Sure. So I've been working in professional tennis now for 7 years. I've done a bunch of different roles across my time. I started in the PR department of the tour. I went through commercial, and I've now landed in corporate communications and also Web3. The ATP Tour, for those of your audience who may not know, we're the men's professional tennis tour. We have a global tour of more than 60 events in 30 countries. We run from January to November each year. And on our tour plays all of the best tennis players in the world, from the world number 1 right the way down through the rankings. So I've had quite a colourful ride at the tour. It's been a great journey. I've loved wearing different hats. Web3, I started my crypto journey back in 2020. It was Bitcoin as my first sort of entry point into the ecosystem. And it kind of coalesced with the time that sports started exploring NFTs, started exploring Web3 more seriously. And I'm now pleased to say that Web3 has become an official function at the tour as of January this year, which is super exciting.
Which is amazing, right? Like just to think of that journey, and I really want to dig into that journey. Can you recall the first time that Web3 was brought up internally at a meeting at the ATP?
I would say it's probably around March 2021, right around the sort of NBA Top Shots hype cycle. Yeah. Like a lot of sports teams, we delved in like a lot of brands, asking the questions of what can we do, what should we do, where should we be playing? And it took us a really long time to figure out what our first play should be. We can talk about that in a second. But I would say around about that time, March 2021.
And what was the reaction internally from senior stakeholders when it was brought up by whoever it was brought up by?
I mean, I would say that we are lucky to have really sort of visionary and forward-thinking leadership, both from our CEO and our chairman and also our board. It's probably not uncommon that the level of sort of technical understanding of Web3 as an industry isn't maybe the highest, but we got an incredible mandate from them. They said, we believe in this long term. We want you to go out, take risks, try not to spend too much money or get tied up into contracts, but go out and explore. And honestly, I couldn't have asked for a better mandate. And, we launched our first project at the end of last year, which thankfully did super, super well, which also helped with the reaction internally. But no, we've always been very forward-thinking, I would say.
And can you tell me how you ended up taking point on this internally? Like, was there a meeting room where someone says, does anyone know anything about this thing? And you put your hand up? Or was it like, let's just give it to the youngest guy in the room?
So, I mean, we're a very small team to start with. I mean, as a company, we're about 150 employees globally. So we're pretty lean as an organization. Web3 started out, I guess, like most brands, in the business departments in our commercial team. And it was a gradual process, started getting involved in more calls. And then it quickly became apparent that of the teammates and the team members looking at this, I was the most passionate and the most involved. And so naturally over time, it became my role.
And you mentioned that there was an internal mandate and that you have kind of visionary upper management, but were there any people internally at the organization that were a bit more dubious and challenged you on a lot of the things that were happening?
There's always the skeptics. There's always the person in the office who kind of smirks when you walk in and asks how Bitcoin's doing that week. And funnily enough, when we were launching our project at the back end of last year, I told some colleagues, we're launching our first ever NFT. This was December last year, so peak sort of FTX FUD.
Yeah.
And I remember his response was, have fun selling 5, as in you're nuts to be even trying this. So, it doesn't come from a place of malice or anything like that. It's just a lack of understanding. It takes a long time to understand crypto Web3, the cyclicality of the market.
Or a general dislike, right? I think there are people that maybe understand it to an extent and they're just like, I just don't like this thing. As I'm sure people were about Facebook when it first came out. And now we're seeing the Apple Vision Pro where we're seeing like, this is not real life. Like, what?
Yeah.
So even I definitely agree. There is like a lot of like people that I speak to where they're like, oh, what is an NFT? Like, isn't it just a QR code or whatever, basically? And there is sometimes fundamental misunderstanding. Sometimes people just dislike the technology or the culture, whatever it may be.
Sure.
But sorry, that segues really well into the love drop. And a lot of people in the industry will know that it's done really well. I'd love to get your A to Z from we're going to do an NFT project to you launch this thing on Art Blocks.
Yeah.
And just before that, why don't you give the audience a little bit of a kind of one-liner about what love is for the uninitiated?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll start by sort of rewinding to August last year. We had spent by that point a year and a half discussing what could be our first step in Web3 and really coming to terms with the fact that we have a number of fundamental limitations in the space. The most obvious one, I would say, is around IP fragmentation. Unlike a sport like the NBA or the Premier League, where you have collective license to leverage player IP, we don't have that in tennis. And it's just one example of the way that our IP is fragmented. So it's August. We have our year-end finals every year in November. It's an amazing event in Turin where only the top 8 players in the world qualify. It's the flagship event of our season. And we were desperate to get our feet wet and to start. And so the question became, well, what actually do we have as a tour to play with? What can we leverage? And the answer, while it isn't immediately obvious, was data. Tennis is an incredibly data-rich sport. Around the court, you have 12 high-definition cameras that capture an incredible amount of data every fraction of a second. Ball trajectory, velocity, player position. It's the reason actually that tennis is the second most bet on sport in the world. There's so many data points from it. And so we had this data to work with, but it wasn't immediately obvious how we could leverage it. And then we arrived at this idea of generative art. Now, I hold my hands up and say that I knew nothing about the generative art space until we started this journey, but it's an incredibly highly engaged and creative pocket of Web3. So our first step was to reach out to Art Blocks. They were having a real moment at the back end of last year, whilst the sort of market was moving one way, the Art Blocks blue chip projects were moving the other. Reached out to them with this pitch, put out an RFP, and they basically went out to their community of artists and said, hey, who wants to work with the ATP on a generative art drop for the finals? We got 5 pitches back, one of which was Martin Grasser's. We were blown away by his passion for tennis, his energy, and also the concept that he put forward to us, which was love. And very simply, love takes 300 unique or impactful moments from the tournament. So it could be the championship point, or it could be a Rafa Nadal hot shot backhand, whatever. And it takes some basic data, ball location, ball speed, and creates from each of the 300 a unique and, in my opinion, beautiful piece of artwork that tells the story of the tournament. It was a crazy compressed process. I mean, we went from concept to execution within 3 months.
Wow.
Including finding partners, going through all of the legal work, front-end development, back-end development, building the team. It was a crazy period. I barely slept. And it was just insanely rewarding to see it go live and do so well.
And what was the reaction internally at the beginning of that 3-month process when you got that concept from Martin? Was it universally loved? Was there a bit of debate, or was it just a go ahead with this is great?
No, positive. I mean, as I said, we got a great mandate from our senior leadership to go out and to take risks. And another thing that I'm super grateful to have is, our team and our management really believe in empowering the team. And so, there were a few people internally who said, I don't really get it, but we trust you. And actually, from my side, we gave a lot of creative control to Marty, the artist, and also to art blocks. I think one of the things we did well early on was to recognize that we are not the experts in this space. They are. And so we were guided by a lot of their creative decisions. One example, edition size. Love was a 300-piece collection. We could have easily made it a 500-piece collection, and I'm confident we would have sold out, which is obviously better for the bottom line. But Marty came to us and said, you take it from a 300-piece collection to a 500-piece collection, and some of the pieces start looking the same. And artistically, it's not as strong. So we said, you know what? We're guided by you. We take your decision. And it ended up paying dividends. So
that's the type of insight you can only get on a podcast like this. Fast forward a little bit in terms of it minting out and doing really well.
Yeah.
Can you give us some of the data behind just how well this thing's done?
Yeah, sure. So the project, first of all, sold out within 20 minutes, which was pretty staggering considering where we were in the market, right? It was beginning December, peak FUD. We sold the thing out in 20 minutes. We actually could have done it quicker if we didn't have a technical glitch, but sold the thing out in 20 minutes. All 300 went. We became the number one trending project on OpenSea globally, which was pretty cool to see. And to date, we've done over $2.5 million in trading volume,
wow,
which is honestly staggering for a collection of 300 tennis-related JPEGs. So really, really encouraging.
Can you recall the feeling when it minted out? Because it's, as you said, 3 months of sleepless nights culminating all in this one moment.
Yeah.
And is it going to be like what your colleague said, where it sells 4 and not 300, or is it going to mint out? And what was the feeling for you working on this so hard, and for Marty and Art Blocks when it did sell out?
No, honestly, euphoria. As you say, you've dedicated months of your time and your energy to something that you really don't know whether it will succeed or fail. You've got support internally, but then you've also got naysayers. We all got on a call with the team. Funnily enough, I was at the Accenture offices doing a conference and excused myself to go and mint this thing out. And, we've got people connecting from all different parts of the world. You're on the Zoom call, and it's go time. We had indication in the lead up to the drop that there was a lot of interest from the generative art community, and that was super important. We worked with an agency called Artex Code, who did a lot of the work building hype in the art community in the months and weeks leading up to the drop. So we had a sense that there was good interest, but we could never have predicted the level that we received. So anyway, we get on this call, right? And it's a manual process. We actually went with a Dutch auction, which is quite an interesting mechanic. So for listeners who don't know, you start at a very high price and you reduce it. And we chose to do that basically to protect consumers from high gas prices and congestion and failed transactions. But the one caveat to that is that Dutch auctions are run manually. So we were literally there, Marty changing the price every 10 minutes using his MetaMask. And what was hilarious is that we started actually the auction at 3 ETH. And for the first price drop, he didn't realize that he was denominating in ETH. He thought he was denominating in Wei or something like this, whichever way around.
Yeah.
And so for 5-7 minutes there, each piece was actually on the market for 20 million ETH, which is hilarious. So that was funny. We had 5-7 minutes during the 20 that there were no sales. And I wonder if that kind of drove additional hype because people saw this crazy high price and couldn't get their hands on them. And then anyway, when the price came back to what it should have been, the thing more or less sold out at that moment, which was crazy. And then, the reaction internally was great. Just to see that the thesis had played out, the reaction internally that we knew what we were doing, there was an opportunity here. It was so cool. Yeah.
Have you seen your colleague who said that you sell 5?
I reminded him of that, and anyway, he wasn't too bitter.
I'm presuming he didn't win, right?
He did not win.
What was it like working with Art Blocks and Martin Grass, the artist? What was that process like from going to them, getting the concept, and then working with them throughout?
Yeah, honestly, incredibly positive. Art Blocks were incredibly detail-oriented and very hands-on from the start, right from helping us craft an RFP that would resonate with the community through to connecting with the artists. And they were on every call, sharing their guidance, sharing their advice, which was great. At the time, we actually launched through their side project, which is called Artblocks Engine, which is essentially their brand arm. It was very new for them. So we were kind of exploring as we went. And then with Marty, I mean, the guy is incredibly creative. He's actually best known for designing the Twitter logo, funnily enough. He's got boundless creative enthusiasm. He works insanely hard. For me, it was an interesting learning experience working with creatives. I didn't have a ton of experience with that before. But no, we were a dream team. It's funny when you work in this space. I mean, there were some developers who helped us build the backend, for example, who I still don't know the name of. They're pseudonymous. They're a CryptoPunk profile picture, I don't know their real names. Just one of the quirks of the space, I guess. But we had a blast.
On the other side of it, obviously, like anything you see out in the open that does really well, there's always a bunch of hurdles to get over on the back end and in the background.
Yeah.
What were some of the things that took you way longer than you thought they would, as someone who'd never been part of a Web3 project before? Something that you thought would take 3 hours that took like 3 weeks.
Yeah. Several things. The data really surprised me. As I mentioned, tennis generates a lot of this data, and we got a dump of just raw data that I couldn't even read. I didn't even have the program to open it, which tracks the ball in 3D and the player in 3D every 0.02 seconds. So reams of data. God. So taking this data and figuring out, okay, what are the important points that are sort of impactful, deciphering that took time. Even basic things like, how big is the tennis court? How wide are the lines? Then ethical questions. Well, what if the ball is actually out, but the art makes it look in?
Yeah.
So sort of integrity questions.
Yeah.
So that took a really, really long time. The other part was legal. We had large legal costs, I'll be honest, in getting this project off the ground. And that was purely representative of the fact that we were working in an unusual space. What is a crypto wallet? How do we manage crypto payments? What about secondary royalties, working with multiple parties? It was complicated and expensive, and we learned a lot. So for us, those two, the data and the legal, but then also the art. Marty, I mean, he worked 18-hour days for 3 months straight, getting the art to look like what it does. And it's deceptively simple. You look at the artwork and you say, yeah, it's a tennis ball, but there's all sorts of minutiae that make it so visually compelling.
Like one snippet of input data changes and it's like a completely different image, right?
I mean, everything. So the ball lands, right? And it's got a speed and it's got a location, but then it's got a perspective, it's got a zoom, it's got a color gradient, it's got texture, all these subtle things that make it really visually appealing. That just took time and iterations, and full credit to him. He grinded until it was perfect.
Just to get into the legal side a little bit more, I speak to a lot of sports brands, rights holders and such, and this is one of their biggest hurdles. Was there anything specific that you didn't think was going to be an issue, but then ended up, again, taking so much more of your time, legal costs and logistics?
Yeah, I mean, several things. Firstly, I would say we had multiple parties working on this project, which introduces complexity, as you can imagine. IP was another one that we just didn't anticipate, like who truly owns the IP behind the art? What are their rights? What can they do with it once the project is live and out there in the world? That was a big question. Even down to the minutiae of things like payments. At the time, we as a company didn't have a crypto wallet. So,
because why would you, right?
Why would we? How do you account for it? Who custodies it? What is the transfer schedule? When is it, transferred to fiat at what date?
What are the tax implications?
Who pays tax? All of this complexity. Like every question you answered, 5 more was behind the door. So a deep rabbit hole we went down.
I've been there where I've been consulting or in-house at a company, and a creative will be like, this is an amazing idea. Like, we want to work with this Web3 sports project, and they want to give us an NFT, or they want to give us this or that. And I'm like, okay, like logistically, who's going to custody the wallet?
Yeah.
Is it going to, imagine you've got like 3 co-founders. Are you going to have a Gnosis safe and each of you have a MetaMask owned by the company, but you have the keys to? And again, there are a lot of horror stories. I remember there was a Swiss exchange in 2019 where the founder died and died with the private keys, and loads of people couldn't get access to their crypto because this person had like the private keys to the vault, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there are great commercial custodial solutions out there.
Absolutely.
And, I mean, the big players all offer great products. We're now, I'm happy to say, set up with our own wallet, but still that took time. Getting that through compliance and legal. Speaking internally, what is crypto? How do we account for it? How do we manage it? So we've gone through that process now, but at the time of love, we simply just didn't have the time to get there.
And reflecting on the entire love experience, it's gone phenomenally well. There were some hurdles in the background, but if there was something you could go back and change, or if you were going to do this over again, what would it be?
I've always said that love, phenomenal success, as you mentioned, but the one thing that we didn't do in the project was cater to true tennis fans, both by the nature of the project, generative art, and also by the price point. This was always going to be quite a niche product. And as expected, these things were bought by crypto natives, by generative art collectors. They weren't bought by tennis fans. We initially set out to cater to both. And we had plans of, having fiat on-ramps and custodial wallets to appeal to the tennis audience and marketing through our CRM database. In the end, there wasn't the time. And we realized that we would be better served.
Additional legal complexities as well. Right?
Additional legal complexities, more vendors, more contracts, more time, more complexity. And so in the end, about 6 weeks out, we decided to simplify the approach and say, okay, guys, let's go crypto only. Let's focus on one core audience, which is what we did. And the results were positive. So that's actually, for me, the big challenge looking forward. And it's what every brand is grappling with. How do you make this stuff mainstream? How do you truly engage your audience? And how do you add value to their experience? And that's, I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second, but that's what we're thinking about.
Good foreshadowing.
Yeah, looking forward.
So how would you say the success of the Love project had an impact on your mandate internally at the ATP when it comes to Web3?
In January this year, we actually, as a company, made Web3 its own official function. So previously it had sat under the business team, and now it's a standalone arm. Innovation is at the core of all of our business decisions. Our chairman and our CEO are constantly talking about innovation. We see ourselves as an entertainment brand. We're competing not only with other sports, but we're competing with entertainment platforms, Netflix, Spotify, anything which grabs and holds the attention of consumers. So innovation is this kind of central thread to all we do. And I think they see and saw the potential for Web3 to continue driving that forward, from a fan engagement point of view, from a revenue generation point of view, all of the above. So natural transition.
Amazing. Its own function in under 12 months.
Pretty cool.
Quite the success.
Pretty cool.
Before we move on to part 2, where we take a look at the future a little bit more, I need to remind you that this podcast is supported by the HBAR Foundation, who are an ecosystem accelerator of Hedera, the most used sustainable enterprise-grade DLT for the decentralized economy. Together with industry-leading use cases and globally renowned partners, the foundation is actively scaling Web3 consumer engagement across the metaverse, gaming, DeFi, regenerative finance, and beyond. So Mark, Love's done fantastically. The ATP Tour has now got a dedicated function to Web3. A very broad and difficult question, but what does the future look like for the ATP and Web3?
Big question. I really am an advocate and push hard for a focused approach and also doing fewer things. I think keeping things simple on Love really served us well, and that's kind of the ethos that I want to take forward with the tour. And so what that means, I think, is focusing on the use cases that truly make sense for your audience. For your listeners, brands will receive a ton of emails from very well-meaning metaverse projects and social tokens and Web3 games. That's fine, and it may be a fit for your business, but for tennis and the tennis fan base, I don't think they're quite a fit yet. So what are we focusing on? For me, number one is art, as an extension of the Love project. Incredibly highly engaged community. There's so many creative things we can do, and it's also something that fans get intuitively. The second, and probably the one I'm most excited about, is the loyalty idea. It's a bit of a buzzword in Web3 at the moment between what brands like Starbucks are doing or what Manchester United is doing, but I see an incredible amount of upside in terms of fan engagement and also value add to our fan base. So that's super exciting. And then the third one is probably fantasy. again, something that sports fans intuitively understand, they get. And but those are the three sort of verticals that I would most like to focus on this year and next year.
Just quickly touching on the loyalty point, I mean, we've seen what Adidas are planning with alts, what Nike have done with .swoosh. I mean, these aren't specifically loyalty programs, but quasi-loyalty programs to Starbucks, who are kind of trying to engineer their success in kind of Web2 loyalty to kind of Web3 with varying degrees of success. What do you think the main reasons are that loyalty could be a really powerful driver and a great use case for this technology?
I mean, for us specifically, I mean, let's talk about me.
Absolutely, yeah.
I am a loyalty nut. I remember traveling 6 months a year on the road for the tour and just being obsessed with, for example, the Hilton loyalty program. I remember going out of my way to stay in a Hilton hotel, even if it was 30 minutes away from the main hotel, just to collect my points so I could have my holiday at the end of the year. So I was a complete nut and a real believer in the model. For us, I mean, I think it comes down to the structure of our sport. Unlike a team sport where you have a home base, you have a home stadium, you wear the jersey, you sing the song, you're part of a social movement. Tennis is much more decentralized. We, first of all, are global. So you may live in a city like Hamburg or Beijing or Sydney, and you may have tennis in your city 1 week of the year, and then not again for 12 months. It's very different. And then also it comes down to the fractured nature of our sport. You've got the men's tour, the WTA tour, and then you've got the four majors. You've got another body called the ITF. And so our fan experience is very fragmented. And so our vision for a loyalty program is kind of like a digital membership club that tracks your unique journey through the tennis ecosystem based on where you live, what events you go to, what streams you watch, what merchandise you buy, and then is able to reward you. And as I said, due to the sort of global decentralized nature of our fan base, I think that Web3 is the technology that can really bring that to life.
I've had a couple of really interesting conversations recently with some ex-colleagues and some friends about how the penny drop for many on the CRM perspective with data, rather than being kind of encumbered and reliant on siloed things like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And I only really drew this comparison when I thought about my newsletter, right? Because Sporting Crypto, I can download my subscribers every day if I wanted to. And anytime I want to leave Substack because I don't like it as a provider anymore, I can do that. The issue with like CRM and like being encumbered by like siloed verticals from a data perspective is actually this idea of like an on-chain network of fans that you can leverage and that can leverage the ecosystem itself via an application, whether it be centralized wallet on a phone or a decentralized wallet on a computer. That kind of network is really powerful, and having ownership of that as an organization and a body is kind of a game changer for the data nuts, right?
It's a game changer. I mean, I would also say, like, in what we're describing, actually, we as a company wouldn't have ownership of that data. That data would sit with fans and the individual wallets. In something like what we're envisaging, the level of granularity of fan profiling would be off the charts. I mean, if you could see every event that a fan has gone to across a season, when they've bought a beer, when they've bought a t-shirt, when they've watched a stream, you get a really unique picture of a fan's journey through that world. And then you take it a step further and you think, well, what are the opportunities, for example, brands? Limitless. So if you're a global sponsor of the tour, let's pick an Emirates, for example, and you want to reward the Madrid-based tennis fans who also might like to fly to Dubai for the tennis in February, you can airdrop them a 10% discount, for example, to their wallet. You can look on chain, identify that subset, and provide really valuable and targeted rewards that benefit the user. And then also, when we think about it from a purely Web3 point of view, build a community or a database of wallets large enough, and suddenly all of these new doors open in Web3. So if you are a top player and you're launching a new PFP collection, you've suddenly got 1 million highly engaged wallets who you know love tennis, who you can whitelist, give pre-sale access to, give a discount to. So the data part is crazy and super exciting, and I'm by no means a data expert, but I think it's something that a lot of brands should be very excited about.
And the permissionless nature of some of those activations potentially. And again, there are, from an IP perspective, if like a bad actor wanted to give access to all the ATP fans, give access to a drop or some sort of NFT to all the ATP fans, there is potential to stop that, legally speaking. But if Martin Grasser, artist from the Love Collection, wanted to do another collection that maybe was to do with sports more broadly, or his best tennis memories as a generative art project, he could give access to those tennis fans as well. So the opportunities are kind of boundless. And what we saw with the news that we're recording this week, we saw EA Sports and Nike.
Your favorite project, your favorite collab. I've been so excited seeing how excited you've been about that. It's gotten me hyped up.
Like, this is the craziest headline ever. But and people have been talking about this for 5 or 6 years, this idea of kind of interoperability and blah, blah. And actually from the brand side, it's really powerful. And so the idea that, a dot swoosh could create a Converse tennis legacy thing, because Nike owns Converse, and then reward fans via, the ATP's loyalty program, is really interesting. All those potential connections. I think people aren't thinking outside the box and broadly enough about how big the possibilities are.
And that's exactly the pitch I have when I talk about this stuff internally, is that we actually don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
Like the experiences and the rewards and the access that you can grant fans in worlds and products that don't even exist yet is boundless. And by building on these Web3 tech rails, you are optimizing for interoperability and future value add to your fans versus doing something closed, Web2, siloed, which is closed to the world. So yeah, spot on.
Let's move on from loyalty a little bit. After the success of Love, you mentioned that there are a lot of well-meaning people in the kind of Web3 world, but also the agency world reaching out, trying to collaborate on projects. What has it been like since the success of Love and since having this profile, in the space as an innovator, as a brand, in terms of the inbound? How difficult has that been?
I mean, not difficult. There's definitely been a big uptick in inbound from providers, other sports teams reaching out, asking for our advice. Conference appearances, podcast appearances. It's been really cool. It hasn't been difficult. Sometimes managing the amount of pitches can be a challenge, but no, there's been no downsides to the success of Love.
And switching gears a little bit, has it been easier and more difficult since Love, considering the kind of macro market climate and also the crypto climate, which has been, we're definitely in a crypto winter, right?
Yeah.
But also from a macro perspective, inflation, less expendable income, markets tanking. I know that the Nasdaq's up recently, but it's been carried by some of the big tech stocks, for example. Yeah. And there are a lot of people think we're in a quite precarious situation economically and specifically in the crypto world. Has it been easier or more difficult since the latest crypto winter started for you folks at the ATP?
Counterintuitively, I would actually say easier. We're obviously operating in a completely different paradigm right now. As you mentioned, consumer spending is way down. Things like sponsorship money, which 18 months ago was, I wouldn't say in abundance, but was flowing around. Now that's not the case. But what has changed, I think, due to where we are now, the good actors are still building. And by extension, some of the less credible ones have fallen by the wayside, which makes your due diligence process a little bit easier. But I would also say this quiet time has been great because inboxes are a lot emptier, right? It's a lot easier to get on the radar of the top chains, the top developers, the top agencies, because not everybody's clamoring to get in. When the hype cycle does return, and I'm confident it will, and once prices start going up and once people are talking about crypto again, it's going to get a lot harder to get on the radar of some of these big players. So we've had very productive conversations. Obviously, we're looking at it through a different lens of reduced budgets, reduced potential revenue from some of these projects. But overall, it hasn't slowed us down. It's been good.
What advice would you give to rights holders who haven't dipped their toe in the Web3 waters yet, or have done so with varying degrees of success?
I mean, I think the first starting question is whether this truly is for your company or not. Web3 for Web3's sake is not good for anybody. I mean, during a hype cycle, when there's buzzwords like metaverse, it can become tempting to jump in, even if there isn't a robust business rationale or business case behind it. So that's really the first question to ask. And then if you've decided that Web3 is for you and you do want to pursue it, I mean, there's a few principles I think that served us well. Keep things simple is one. Be comfortable with risk and be open to failure. Bit of a cliche, but it's true. And then probably I would say empower your team. It's a bit of a generalization, but I think this is a bit of a young person's game, Web3. And so there will be people at your company, possibly in more junior roles, who are passionate about this stuff. And from my perspective, I was completely empowered to go out and take risk and explore. And that was great. And that's what I would advocate for other companies to look at.
And then more broadly, outside the ATP, but maybe there are some links here. What are you most excited by in the kind of sports Web3 world or Web3 more broadly?
I mean, the Nike story, the dot swoosh, thanks to you. I'm extremely hyped about it. But no, of course, that's a massive watershed moment. NFTs and video games. I mean, come on, like how many people play Madden, play FIFA, play NBA 2K? It's enormous.
EA Sports FC soon.
There you go. That's crazy exciting. The loyalty, as I mentioned, huge upside. There's a reason that brands like Starbucks are building out a Web3 offering. I absolutely love what Reddit have done. Again, kudos to Sporting Crypto for breaking it down in the most accessible and friendly way. But you can't argue with the success. 10 million wallets opened, incredible price point, marketed like a dream, made easy for consumers. Brilliant. Also super bullish on art. I think there's a ton of upside in digital art. For me, art is the perfect use case of NFT technology.
It makes so much sense
in the world. It's perfect for that industry. And then to kind of go a bit more niche, I'm really bullish on the sort of the level of developer activity in general that we've seen since the bull market. Developers have stuck around. You've seen incredible developments in layer 2 scaling solutions. You've seen fun stuff happening on Bitcoin with Ordinal. So like the development side of things is really, really healthy, and that bodes well for the next cycle. And I'm just looking forward for prices to return as well. That will be fun.
And you mentioned before we started recording that you were quite excited in a weird way about the regulatory developments, especially in Europe and Asia and such. From your perspective, at a big rights holder, how good is it to see some of those regs start forming in a much more formal way?
Yeah, I mean, this conversation's happening against the backdrop of 2 crazy lawsuits in the last 24 hours by the SEC. So maybe this is a bit of a misguided or a hot take. But no, I think what's happening in Europe, I'm no regulation expert, but to have MiCA come in, which has kind of standardized the rules of the road across the European Union, is encouraging. We're seeing other markets taking the front foot in making the rules of the road clearer. It's essential for companies. Like if you're a big brand, you can't be operating in uncertain territory. So I hope the US can get its act together and there can be a little bit more clarity on that side of the pond. But bullish for crypto regulation in the EU and places in Asia as well.
I mean, even in the UK, right, we've seen reports recently around recommendations from investigations that this needs to be regulated properly and promptly. And so I think seeing the EU do what it's done, and also the UK having moved away from the EU and being like, oh, we should probably do that. And actually, there could be an advantage being a fast follower, because you can look at those regulations and be like, well, actually, that doesn't really work. We should be adding this and that, and then formalize something that's a really good structured framework. Then in Asia, you're seeing stuff in China with white papers, Hong Kong opening, retail-based trading. I think Singapore, before we jumped on to record this, have just given Circle, is it an e-money license or some other sort of financial regulatory license, which is quite exciting.
And then look what's happening in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Crypto.
In Saudi Arabia, UAE, and there is a lot going on there as well, which is awesome. And so, yeah, to back up your point, I do hope that what's happened with Binance and Coinbase in the last week or so, as we're recording, settles in some way and there is some clarity, because I think that is the biggest killer, right? And the biggest stifler is that there hasn't been a lot of clarity over the last 3 years. And in a lot of the world, apart from probably I'd say the States, Canada and Australia, we're seeing quite a lot of clarity or the burgeonings of that. And I think by the time this technology matures a lot more over the next decade, there'll be some more formalized frameworks that help brands, especially, right? I wrote about .swoosh, the amazing, exciting collaboration with EA Games. The two things that I kind of not questioned, but queried and said, two things I'm really interested in seeing how they develop. One is monetization and kind of incentive alignments, but two, the legals, right? When you go when you have a global game of 150 million players, like EA Sports FC, daily. What happens when someone in Canada buys an NFT and it's against the local regulations, but you're following European and US regulatory framework, right? There's no global guidance on this thing. And so operating globally is a lot more difficult.
And that's before you even start looking at things like tax and filing proper tax returns. It's an area you have experience in crypto. It's not pretty.
It's not easy. It's not easy. It can be expensive. As expensive as your tax bill to get a specialist to help. Conversely to what you're really excited about, what do you think is being kind of overhyped right now that you don't see in the same way as those people that are hyping, or you don't see a big future for it in Web3 or kind of sports Web3?
I never like to say that things are overhyped or that I don't believe in them. I tend to think that things are either at the right time or early. So take the metaverse, for example. It's a lot of people like to criticize it in its current form, but I think you zoom out and you look at the direction of travel, we are going that way. We will be spending more time in digital worlds. We will be working, socializing, learning in these digital worlds. It's just a little too early. Something like the announcement this week with Apple's Vision Pro is one of those massive step changes that takes that conversation to another place. But also things like, Web3 games. There's a lot of great fun Web3 games that have an initial burst and hype cycle and then can't find a sustainable business model to survive. It doesn't mean that the theory behind Web3 games is wrong. It's just we haven't arrived at sustainable business models yet. So everything at its right time. And that's why I come back to our approach and taking a very focused look and looking at the use cases that we know work and we know that will appeal to our fan base. That's why I have the thesis that I do.
Amazing. Well, it's been a pleasure having you, Mark. Thank you so much. Where can people find out more about you?
It's a bit of a boomer answer, but best place to reach me is on LinkedIn at Mark Epps. And I also write a newsletter inspired actually by sporting crypto called Into Web3. So please subscribe.
Great breakdown on Ledger's comms disaster as well from a comms specialist. If you're a person looking at how to not do comms in Web3 and what they should have done, read that.
The comms is fascinating in this industry. Obviously, it's always on. It moves incredibly quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty. And then you've got this cast of characters, right? From Brian Armstrong, CEO of Coinbase, who's very pro-establishment, pro-regulation, to more rogue players like CZ, head of Binance. I mean, it's just you've got this really colorful cast of characters. Everyone's building the car as it's going on. And the comms is fascinating to watch. There are some great use cases, great case studies, and there are some shockers. So it's fun to watch. So subscribe if you'd like a breakdown.
And speaking of subscribe, please do subscribe to this podcast, Sporting Crypto Podcast. We're going to be doing this on a seasonal basis. And if you haven't already subscribed to the newsletter, Sporting Crypto newsletter, which you can find at sportingcrypto.substack.com, keeping you up to date on all things sports and Web3. You can find me at Pet Berisha, PETBERISHA on Twitter and on LinkedIn at Petriparisha as well. And just remember that none of what we have said during this show is financial or business advice, and the content is for informational purposes only. Web3 is underpinned by crypto, and crypto is volatile, meaning you can lose money if you're buying these assets personally or as a business. Where we are recording right now in the UK, the majority of crypto asset companies are unregulated. Please give us a rating of 5 stars wherever you listen to your podcast, whether it be Spotify, Apple. And if you're watching on YouTube, please drop us a like and leave us some feedback in the comments. Even if it's scathing, it will help the show in the future. Once again, thank you very much for listening or watching, and we'll have more of the Sporting Crypto podcast for you shortly.